My latest invention.
What, a police box?
Of course not.
This is TARDIS.
TARDIS?
It stands for Time and Relative Dimension in Space.
Oh.
Go inside. Go on.
Yeah?
Has cast a spell. Moon struck on the edge. Get me out of this hell. 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 Struck on the edge, I've never seen the stars so clear. Struck on the edge, I've never seen the stars so clear. Evil magician has cast a spell. A predator lying through my teeth. Overlords of entropy. A predator lying through my teeth. Overlords of entropy. I know only I can. I know only I can save me. I know only I can save me. I know only I can save me. Get me out of this now. I know that I can save me. I know that I can save me. A predator lying through my teeth. I know only I can.
Welcome back to Path of the Fool after the extra long card 6 analysis, but important because we had to lay down many of the themes that we'll be dealing with in the next 2 to 3 cards and maybe others. Concepts relating to time and to selfhood and that kind of thing. Before the Lover, in the Hierophant and Emperor, we looked at the negative side of metaphysics, Gnostic beliefs. Then we took another perspective, which is always very important. Not asserting a point of view, but taking another perspective to maybe look at some of the more positive aspects of the mystic tradition, because in every tradition there's both positive and negative. We can move on now and look at card number 7. It's enigmatic in its own way, especially bringing out concepts of time a little deeper than we had time to do before. But we can start with the image of this interesting card. It's the first one that shows any kind of locomotive or vehicle. It's also a card that involves movement to a degree. It's numbered 7. But just the imagery of a charioteer reminds us of Icarus, maybe, or Phaeton, who flew up in the chariot. Phaeton did. Icarus took to flight to go near the sun. See, this is a card that is Cancerian. The next one is Leo, so it can recall that imagery. Plato, in his book The Phaeton, refers to the fact that the soul, upon entering the creation, is sort of driving a chariot. Or that chariot is often seen driven by a female. Well, that could be Sophia, couldn't it? It's the universal goddess or mother bringing the soul into the creation in exactly the same way that physical mothers do. But there's numerous traditions that show a goddess in relationship to a chariot, many images of that. And those horses, given that there's two horses, sometimes there's more, but the two horses, and we certainly see two sphinxes drawing the chariot of the figure, the charioteer. But those sphinxes or horses represent then opposites, obviously, because we've seen opposites featuring so much as we move through these cards, both again in a positive and a negative way. But then they could represent, well, they're black and white, so is it two hemispheres of consciousness, two faces of a single self or soul? Are they solar and lunar? Are they overworld and underworld? Are they eros and thanatos, that's life and death? Are they the engaged person as opposed to the indifferent person? In other words, the different kinds of personalities, burning hot and cold, that we find in ourselves and in human beings? Or are these sphinxes or horses, because they're black and white, do they represent the psychopomp, like we normally associate with, say, Mercury, or the dog in the card number 22, the Fool? Can the horse also represent the manner in which the hero transits the underworld and returns? Well, that's a very famous myth. That's a very famous motif in ancient myths, the horse, taking the hero or the traveller or the seeker into the dark realms of the unknown and bringing him back. So we're already making sense of the card at that point. But because it's connected with the Cancer and the whole idea of birthing, mother sign, water sign, whatever, the goddess bringing in the soul, the Sophia giving birth to the soul, we're dealing then with the concept of incarnation. And this was supremely important to the mystery schools and to the priests and even to the pharaohs. In fact, one of the reasons why the pharaoh is with crossed arms could be seen not as denoting death, we went into this previously, but denoting the fall of the soul into matter. This is how many ancient people saw it. It's a kind of a birth, yeah, but it's almost like a rebirth here on earth. A kind of an alchemical transformation at that point. Is this why the face of Osiris was black? Is this why there was such an emphasis on the descent into the underworld and resurrecting as an androgyne, a kind of a mystic birth? But just on a simple level, the idea that you were a pure spirit and you entered this creation for whatever reason, and then there's trials and tribulations, many lives and deaths, many rebirths all the way through. It was very common in the mystery school tradition. We can look at the letter, the esoteric letter. The chariot, even the word chariot, when it comes to etymology, means car of the sun. So there you have that Icarus Phaeton image again. That's where we get words like chair and cart and carriage and carousel and chassis, the chassis of a car. In Hindi, the word for the number 4 is char. And that's interesting because Cancer, that rules this card, is actually the 4th house of the zodiac. So it could be connected, maybe it's connected, that term, that word. And in Mexico, the number 4 is Can, C-A-N-N, which also represents the serpent. But in tarot studies, in the sacred language, Hebrew, Iberu, great Iberu languages, the letter of this card is Cheth. It's almost like C-H. But it can also be Heth, or without the C, or Het, H-E-T, as simple as that. But it's usually Cheth with a C at the beginning. And that probably came from the Phoenician Canaanite Kaith, like the lady's name, Catherine, or Catherine. Kate, Catherine, very similar. The Egyptian, if I can remember correctly, the hieroglyph for this letter, for this Phoenician Canaanite letter, denotes a kind of a closure or a courtyard, an area set apart. That's quite important again when we think of the Druids and of sacred precincts and what have you. But it could also, as I said, represent the human body. The idea of enclosure, the idea of materialization, incorporealization into the world, incarnation. And it could even represent the material world, that enclosure. Probably did, indicating again the fall of spirit into body. But of course, we're only assuming, because we come from a Christian world, that the ancient mystery schools of the Phoenicians, Canaanites, and even Egyptians saw it the way we do, as a negative thing. Have we ever stopped in time to think that we call it a fall, and of course that implies immediately a negative thing? But maybe they saw the arrival of the soul into the world as another one of the soul's moments, another one of something that's happening to the soul, not necessarily negative. That maybe the soul is here for specific reasons, and they were okay with that. They didn't necessarily see it as a veil of tears or whatever. But again, different traditions. Even within a place like Egypt, there wasn't just one tradition. There was numerous different schools, numerous different perspectives, numerous different priesthoods. But of course, this is the 7th card. Card number 7. So 7, wow. That's a biggie. 3 and 4. We met 7 and the 12 and the 3 and the 4 in the table of the magician. And now here we have it smack dab again. I mean, just look at the symbolism of the card with the square base. And you can see that the top part, you could draw a triangle there. So it's a square base. And the charioteer is very much posed as a triangle geometrically. But 7 is the planets, isn't it? 7 is the directions. It's the prime number also, and that's interesting because 7 then is the number that doesn't divide equally into 10 or to 360. Try all the other numbers between 1 and 10, divide it into 10 or 360, and they all fit exactly with no remainder. 7 leaves a remainder. And that meant it was the virgin number, but also the number that belongs to itself, that's sectioned off. And in other traditions, it's a number that is connected to rebellion, to iconoclasm, to being an outcast and an outsider. Hindu sages tell us that there was 7 primordial souls in the beginning of time. All of them born twins, except the 7th, who was born alone. So they were on to that idea of separation. And because rebellion, like we saw in the previous program, rebellion and iconoclasm, that is reprehensible to the dogmatists who control the orthodox religions. So then 7 could be a number that's connected to sin, and even to evil for that matter. And occasionally you run across that, like in Christianity, where we have the deadly sins, the 7 deadly sins. But nature delights in the number 7, said Pythagoras. And so to most occultists, to almost all occultists, 7 is the number of perfection. The spiritual mystic telestic number. And we saw how important individualism is to true mystics. That idea of not fitting in, being just ontologically, without even your choice, an outsider who just doesn't go along with the flow. And probably spend half your life wondering why you're like that, which can be part of the trauma experience when you come into the world. But absolutely, when 7 as a number, somewhat like the pentagram does, but when 7 also turns up in a myth, in a text, you know, a story or a folk tale, it's already telling you, watch out, there's an esoteric rendering going on that you should be aware of. It's a little key to tell you, this is moved up an octave. So it's like an apostrophe to alert you, to alert readers that something's going on, like 7 dwarves, Snow White and the 7 dwarves, and all of that kind of thing. And we've seen how the number turns up enormously in astrotheology, looking at the heavens. But it represents the mystic path and the metaphysical level, right? It's turning you on to the fact that the story or what is being heard needs to be analysed on a much deeper level, because it is indeed associated with a telestic type of rites. I mean, we have the 7 veils of Isis, a very important motto of Isis, that she's hidden or veiled by 7 veils. There were 7 main temple complexes on the Nile. 7 great halls mentioned in the Egyptian Book of the Dead. As we saw in the magician card, the pyramid is a base of 4 and sides of 3, exactly like the card is often geometrically shown. We have the 7 stages of the alchemists, we've got the 7 chakras, we have the 7 tattvas of the Hindus, 7 loki on the caduceus. If you look at the caduceus, it always has 7 This is Hermetic. Caduceus always has 7 loci on there. There's meant to be 7 rungs on Jacob's ladder in the Christian tradition. The famous Masonic G is the 7th letter. It took 7 years to complete Solomon's temple, according to that lore. In fact, 7 often represents a complete temple. There's actually 7 letters in the word Solomon. And in fact, many of the other names of various gods, like Abraxas, and Michael, and Raphael, and Orpheus, and Mithras, and Gabriel, they tend to have 7 letters, so that's kind of interesting. The Jewish menorah has 7 branches. There was 7 cities of the Revelation, told in the book of John. There's 7 sacraments. It's at age 7 that in Catholicism a child has the communion, I believe. There's 7 vowels in the esoteric Hebrew alphabet. There's 7 notes in the musical scale. We have 7 days of our week, which obviously was established by some sort of solar cult in the past. And there's 7 references to the number 1, or O-N-E, on the American dollar bill. So it's just a number that you find in sort of uncanny, unusual experiences. Very, very important in the ancient world. I mean, in Ireland you have the Mountain of Patrick, upon which there are 7 shrines to Mary along the way that the climbers stop at. And in Mecca, the revolution of the circle of the Kaaba is 7 times as well. And that's interesting because long before the rise of the patriarchy that now run Islam, that was a tradition. And also the Kaaba, the Black Stone, was commemorated or dedicated to a goddess figure, Magna Dea, the great goddess. And she was served by black-robed priests. That's true. Right, the Beni Shayaba. And they were goddess priests, known as the sons of the old woman. So, interesting that, again, in the patriarchy there's been a lot of appropriation and cannibalization. But you dig down to the roots of things and you find much more ancient motifs. And that means that the number 7 then could indeed be a goddess number, after all. But as I said, Cancer, this card is the 7th card, but it's associated astrologically with, Cancer. And that's interesting because that's number 4. And therefore, on the Kabbalistic tree, there are 4 realms, levels we've spoken of before, right? Atziluth, Bria, Yetzirah, and Asiya. Yeah, but from looking down, the 4th is Asiya, and looking up, it's Atziluth. So there's the world of action, Asiya, and the world of emanation at the top. But they're mirrors. It just depends on the perspective. They have a relationship. One is the mirror of the other. Atziluth, Asiya. In physics, we have 4. Right? Time, distance, space, and speed. We can't think of operating in the material kingdom without those 4 coordinates. 4 features, 4 principles. And one would even ask, if you were philosophically minded, are those there in the world, or are those attributes of our own minds and bodies? Do we shape, by our vision, by our being in the world, do we shape what we see outside ourselves? Is consciousness having that level of an effect? And so those attributes then of time, distance, space and speed would be human templates that maybe reality as it is doesn't possess. It's an interesting line of thought. But this 3-4 geometry that I spoke of, that you can definitely see in this card, the square bottom and the triangular top, that's found in numerous cards. That's found in, we have the Emperor with the 4, it's a very square card, and that's numbered 4. The Hierophant with the 4 evangelic images, which you also see in the Wheel of Fortune, which is the 4 around the wheel. And in the Universal World card, you see that quaternity. And you even catch it, similar geometry, in the Hanged Man. His legs making a 4, and his body with his arms bent behind his back looks like a triangle. So there's been a conscious involvement, a conscious patterning of the 3-4 geometry, just as it was in the Magician card. And that is an interesting motif that you see throughout the deck. But wherever you see the 4 as a base, that is obviously representing the primate material, the mother substance from which everything else arises, consciousness and spirit, self, whatever you want. But on a more simple level, the 4 represents the elements, doesn't it? Fire, water, air, and earth. And in this instance then, the driver, right, the charioteer himself, he could be spirit, the 5th element. which is interesting too. The number 5 that would come in at that point. But certainly the 7 and the 4 and the 3, those are the numbers of importance. But never forget that, yeah, this character, he also has a 7-pointed star, by the way, I forgot to mention. No, it's more like an 8 star, but it's a star in his forehead, 2 crescent moons. There's a lot of astrological symbolism here. But not negating the fact of the 7. Not negating the act also that it could be the quintessence, the 5. Now, it might put us on the right track of understanding the deeper aspects. Now, astrologically, often people make the mistake of assigning this card to Aries, and that's just because it shows a male in a chariot, often carrying a spear and looking fairly fierce. And so this has been totally erroneously attributed by exoteric scholars to Aries. And they have numerous reasons, but we're not going to go into it because it's just, it just makes so little sense that this card is maybe masculine, armored, and warlike, and that might at first not feel right to go with the Cancer sign attributed to water and to mother. But again, we have to dig deep, and you can always attribute it. The correspondence is indeed correct. And one of the reasons is because it makes absolute perfect sense to see the sun, the fool, but the solar hero, passing through the sign of the mother on his way to his royal throne in Leo, which is next. He passes through, right? He's traveling through. This is how the ancients saw it, that the sun passes through, like we said before, up to Gemini, which is the quarter point, up to Cancer, and the very next domicile will be his home, the sun's own domicile of Leo. So he's passing through that sign. And the ancients just looked at that as important, that could also be seen as a birth or a rebirth. Interesting that the water sign of Cancer is symbolized by a chalice, a great cup, and in the Thoth deck you actually see the character holding a grail, holding a cup. That's interesting. Because in Christian art, you often see Christ, the solar king, sitting on the lap of his mother, and often even sitting in what looks like a chalice or a fountain. There are such images. Yeah, with the Christ child sort of rising out of this chalice. Now, Carl Jung comments on this in his wonderful book, The Mysterium Connunctionis, and he says that according to these ancient ideas, the moon is a vessel of the sun. She is a universal receptacle of the sun in particular. So, an ancient motif. Children arise from the womb, and the Grail works as a nice symbol of that. he's also wearing a suit of armor. And that can lead people off in the wrong direction, thinking this is very Martian. But in fact, no. That suit of armor could represent the shell. And again, may symbolize the body of the male, our bodies. There's actually 7 sheaths that surround the fetus. And this is the sign of the mother. So just like in the ancient imagery, it might fit perfectly to see that suit of armor as a kind of a shell. And the charioteer is a kind of a fetus. And in the Rider-Waite, as I pointed out before, they have those 2 crescent moons on his armor to completely emphasize the Cancerian aspects associated with it. We mentioned, I think, in the Lovers, didn't we, that the journey of the son is a journey away from wholeness, but back to it. He has an archetypal understanding of wholeness represented by the mother, and he has to move away from that wholeness, risking fragmentation and division and scission. But the whole goal of his seeking then is to return to a semblance on a higher level, of course, or a deeper level, is more correctly to be said, of that wholeness, to find it within himself. I've always likened this suit of armor to the suit that the astronauts wear. We're talking about the moon anyway, so I don't know about you, but I've always thought of it as being similar to the white suits that are worn by astronauts with the first alleged moon landings. Also were in the sign of Cancer, by the way. And as I hinted at earlier, the whole concept of birth in the ancient, as an ancient mythograph amongst the astrologers and astrotheologists, Cancer was known as the gate of beginning or the gate of birth, with Capricorn at the other side of the zodiac being the gate of death and the gate of ending. So this card and Cancer itself is deeply connected to births and rebirth, spiritual rebirth as well as physical. And the water aspect of the sign just simply, again, is that baptism or that ritual oblation or some other kind of ritual rite. For instance, passing through the wilderness, passing through the desert. And the author, David Ovison, he tells us that in esoteric astrology, Cancer is recognized as being a sort of gateway between the higher and lower worlds. It is Cancer which permits souls to descend into the material realm at the moment of incarnation. So he's commenting on that. And in regards to the progress of the individual, astrologer Peter Damian says that by the 7th year, the new solar ego identity begins to slowly emerge, exercising its fledgling powers of will and individuality while expanding its consciousness through the simultaneous development of mind. So there's those themes again of taking the reins, exercising will, stepping out on one's own, a feeling of independence, and anticipating being in control of one's own destiny. And of course, universally, the number 7 is connected to rites of passage. In the Nocturneron from the sage Apollonius, we read that on the 4th hour, God breathes on the face of man and imparts to him a soul. So those numbers again. 4th hour, right? This card relates to the fourth sign. God breathes upon the face of man and imparts to him a soul, a new birth, a beginning. We often understand cards by looking at them in the context of other cards, and we can certainly do that here, because if you place the 2 cards side by side, this is strength and the chariot side by side. You can see, depending on what side you're looking at, that this is card number 7 and this is card number 8. 78. Now, there's 78 arcanum in the entire tarot deck. But more importantly, these are the cards of the sun and the moon. Cancer is the sign we associate with the moon, and Leo, the next card, is the sign or the card we associate with the sun. So these are very important cards then, because there's the luminaries, the sun and the moon. Not to mention that there's sigils 7 and 8 refer to those luminaries. Is that why you can't change the number of the cards? Can't make it more, can't make it less? Well, I think so. 78 isn't just arbitrary. In fact, if you add the numbers between 1 and 12, which is the zodiac, if we bring in the zodiac, and after all, this charioteer is wearing a belt that shows the signs of the zodiac. Well, the numbers between 1 and 12 also equal 78. So there's a zodiacal correspondence with the tarot, 7 and 8. And those connections are the theme of my mystery school. We go into that, the deep connections between tarot and astrology, numerology and Kabbalah as well. But the numerology is already telling us that there's a connection. We don't normally associate 7 and 8 with the sun and the moon, but here they are very much connected. And they should be side by side, giving us the understanding that the whole deck, it must be 78 cards. 7 plus 8 is 56, and that just happens to be the minor arcana, minus the 4 aces. Right? It also, 5 and 6 would give us the pentagram and the hexagram, the microcosm and the macrocosm. In fact, it's 56 years the cycles of the sun and the moon realign with each other. So 56, 78, the connected numbers, very, very important. In other traditions, the 7th and 8th card, right, or the 4th and 5th houses, are the royal signs, the great royal signs of the northern sky, when the sun reaches its apex. As a matter of fact, Cancer is actually often considered the higher sign. The sun reaches its actual maximum height in the sign of Cancer, not Leo. So there's that also to take in mind. But Leo is often considered the true home. And it's just simply deduced from the seasons. When the sun rises to its 2 highest points, the weather is hot and the sun is burning bright. This was commemorated in Egypt, a very famous motif of the Scarabus beetle pushing the sun. Khepra, the god Khepra, the Scarabus beetle pushing the sun up to its highest point. That beetle was then later, for some bizarre reason, transmogrified into a crab, and so Cancers are, anyone who's born under the sign of Cancer is symbolized by the crab, but it was originally the Scarabus beetle. And in other traditions, the sign of Cancer was commemorated by the white unicorn. Sometimes a white horse, but sometimes, more importantly, the white unicorn. And that's why in heraldry you see the lion, which stands for Leo, and the white unicorn, which is often stands for the sign of Cancer, symbolizing the moon. I mean, it's just as simple as that. I went into all of this iconography in my book on astrotheology. And we see so many motifs that relate to these northern houses, these great solar and lunar houses. For instance, in the American national anthem, we have the term home of the brave. There's only 4 words, and yet you've got home, which is Cancer, bravery, which is Leo. And America's own birthday is also in Cancer. There's 7 rays in the headdress of the Statue of Liberty, and many other symbols in America, like police badges and so on. You see turn up, there are 7 points. An interesting nursery rhyme, Jack and Jill, relates to this movement of the sun up into the highest zones. Jack and Jill go up the hill to fetch a pail of water. Jack falls down and breaks his crown, and Jill comes tumbling after. It's just a reference to Jack the sun, and whatever the sun does, right, goes up to the top, reaches its peak, and then has to decline into the autumn months. Jill falls down and comes tumbling after, so the moon does as well. A lot of interesting areas in which the astrotheological ciphers have been buried, like in playing cards and so on. coming to more of the astrotheology aspects, we know that Cancer is the highest because we have the Tropic of Cancer on a globe or a map, and the Tropic of Capricorn being lower than that, where the sun reaches its lowest point. More interestingly, is that Cancer, as a section of sky, as a constellation or a house of the zodiac, actually doesn't have a lot of bright stars in it. Hardly any. So, unlike Leo or unlike Taurus or even Gemini. So that was known to the ancient mythographers as the wilderness. Right? So the 30, 40 degrees of sky that used to constitute the sign of Cancer was known as the wilderness. Now that's interesting because that term turns up in the life of Abraham, and Jesus and Moses, and the whole concept of the hero having to go through a wilderness experience. John the Baptist even had to do it. And the voice crying in the wilderness and what have you. So Cancer then is very much about rites of passage and traversals. As I said, you've got from Jesus to Joseph and Mary, always a concept of a traversal. The 40 famous days in the wilderness. Now, one constellation within the sign of Cancer is known as the manger, as a matter of fact, or the cradle. And that would appear in the night sky during December. And so, from an astrotheological point of view, that's why we have the nativity story, is because around about the solstice period, the winter solstice, when the ancients looked up in the sky, they saw the signs of Cancer, and the famous manger constellation was there. Again, you can turn to my book on astrotheology for more in depth on those concepts.
Weaving hallucination. Are you prepared?
vitally important constellation is Ursa Major, of course, and that's the original 7 Up, because it has 7 main stars. We've called Ursa Major the Plough, the Swastika, the Bear, the Great Bear, or the Big Dipper. It's also known as the Wagon, or guess what? The Chariot. And Ursa Major, the Chariot, the Wagon, is in the sign of Cancer. So this now makes even more sense as why you have this locomotive and why this figure was drawn. It's very ancient, antique. And as we said, on his belt, he's already got the 12 signs of the zodiac. In Celtic lore, we have the toilsome chair of Taliesin the Bard. And the poem related to that, written by Taliesin, is, I have presided in a toilsome chair over the circle of Sidon, that's the zodiac. Whilst that is continually revolving between the 3 elements, it is not a wonder to the world that men are not enlightened. When we look at the Egyptian connection, we find that this is almost a monumentally important image, because we have the symbol of the pharaoh hunting on his chariot, or going to war on his war chariot. So that, and the pharaoh anyway, as an archetype, certainly fits the Cancerian signs, because he's the son, is he not, of Mother Egypt. And his headgear, and the fact that he wears the tail of the lion, which is a goddess symbol, by the way, and he sits on the cubic throne, which we've already talked about previously. These are all goddess symbols. So they're the symbols of the mother for whom he officiates. We know that in the Amonist schools there were gods of the sun and the moon as well. But like Khonsu or Min or Sin or Thoth, these Middle Eastern gods, they were often worshipped by the lunar cult. In fact, even the Grecian Jupiter, who's often again considered solar, he was often seen with crescent horns on his head. Turn to the Kabbalah, the correspondences, and we find that if we use our 2-tree system, something I think very, very important and relevant comes out. This card will represent on the first tree, Netzach, and zone 7 on the Pillar of Mercy. And that's a feminine Sephirah. Right? It's on the Pillar of Mercy, which is normally masculine to the Pillar of Severity, but it's at the bottom Sephirah. So that's considered, that's a feminine Sephirah. And scholars have different difficulty attributing a planet ruler to that. Some choose Venus, you know, like Bina is Venus, but they also give it the Netzach. The moon could be the moon, a lunar, it's kind of a lunar. That would fit with the correspondence of the card, so I think that's genuine, that's probably an accurate. But I think we can go one step further than that, because sometimes the planet Neptune is attributed to Netzach, and I think that's quite accurate, because in the 2-tree system, we find that the corresponding card to this, to the chariot, is the moon card. And despite the name moon, that's a card ruled by Neptune. And I know that sounds confusing if you're a beginner. Why is the moon card called moon and then not signified or, you know, by the moon? Well, that's just the way it is. The card called the moon is actually ruled by the planet Neptune. We'll get to that card, and when we get there we'll explain more about it. We'll understand its symbolism. We haven't got the time to go into that now. But I will explain the lunar symbolism of that card later. But for now, just let's understand that on the 2-tree system, we find a correspondence between this lunar card, this is lunar, this is ruled by the moon, and the moon card, number 18, but that's ruled by Neptune. So what this does is it helps us with the Kabbalah. It helps us understand that Netzach can definitely be attributed to the moon and to Neptune, and no problem there. But when it comes to analysing this card as we've been doing, we understand that by analysing the moon card, we do understand something about this card. The chariot gives us a new perspective on it. Because is the Neptune, this sort of bleak Neptunian wilderness card, is this the lower octave? Or is this the card representing states that are reprehensible to this masculine, aggressive charioteer, the uncertain wilderness that he always has to cross, or the uncertain wilderness that never will be crossed, charted, circumscribed. If he represents reason, if he represents the ability to conquer, right? The eternal seeker, as we said, yeah, but maybe he has to realize that not everything is going to be subsumed under that reason. Not everything is going to come under the hammer. When you go out seeking, you can get lost in the forest. When you're experimenting with something and trying to prove your ego, you can end up failing. You can end up chasing your tail forever. This was understood by William Blake, who saw the negative aspects of the reason and that type of intellectual, patriarchal, conquestative energy. And he threw it over for the sake of imagination. And imagination is ruled by Neptune and by the moon card. So back of what the charioteer is trying to do, there is that feeling of there's always something I haven't conquered. You know, back of the eros energy, there's always some unsettling feeling that because I built this, I haven't been able to explore that. And also, this moon card, this Neptunian card, can represent the neurosis, which even lies at the root of why that kind of patriarchal, acquisitive, materialistic mindset has even arisen. Didn't it arise out of trauma in the first place? That terrible desire to, like we saw with the horizon and the reason, is to map the world out and get the great compasses out and have everything conform to fixed measurements. But where did that concept even arise? Is it healthy? Or is it totally neurotic? Well, the 18th card here is showing that there is weaker foundations as well as uncharted waters that in the end, you know, if reason and the sons and disciples of reason are never going to get there, they're never going to understand it. We're at that position now when it comes to quantum research, as you see, and the findings of the quantum physicists at this very point. And also, that Neptunian card represents timelessness. Here's the chariot, he's on his wheels, he's on a path. It implies time, and he's got his watch out. He's saying, yeah, I've got a plan, I've got a road to journey on, and I've got desires, and I've got things to be done. But the Neptunian card is saying, yeah, you know, you're rushing because you know that death awaits, that your time is finite and limited. And the things that you want to do, all that charging around, all of that Alexander the Great stuff, yeah, but you have a short period in which to do it. So you're rushing. Because underneath, right, your will, in that sense, is the fear of death and the fear of lack of time. Now, in normal divination, when this card turns up in one of your readings or that you're giving to a client, and if it falls in the upright position, it's obviously about setting out on a journey. I mean, not much we have in common with some of the cards, like the Lover. You know, it's about going it alone, setting out on important journeys, maybe unaccompanied, seizing the reins. This is what this guy's obviously done. He's a young man going it alone, saying, yeah, you know, I'm done with the help, thanks very much. I'd like, can I just go on my own now without the stabilizers and the teachers and the tutors and the peers and the parents and the priest? And negatively, it would mean that it could be, being a Cancer card, it could be conformity. There's a lot of activity and running about and all sorts of plans, but it's really, they don't really step out of the box at all. The person is really seeking safety and security and fitting in, you know. Or on a more of a negative side, it could be flitting and vacillation. See, any cards connected to the moon is connected with vacillation, restlessness, and flitting from one thing to the other. And of course, to over-emotionality, where the emotions are out of control, swelling up to confuse and overwhelm.
provoke your own illumination. Destroy reason. Who will refuse to follow? Abuse of danger, scream of joy. Make love, make love, make love, make love. Who will penetrate, 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 penetrate. Who will chase for thrills, love without fears? Who will fight the magic cards? Who will save Icarus? Who will kill the lamb? Who will abandon the machine? Who will draw a new game board? It might be us, dear freedom seekers, before they close the doors. We must swallow the key and reverse destiny. It might be us, dear freedom seekers, before they close the doors. We must swallow the key and reverse destiny. We are the children of intuition, sons of euphoria, the lovers of magical intoxication. Raise your fists to the sky and scream of joy.
Now, if we move to a deeper analysis of the card, we do find that the lover, especially if you look at the French decks, certainly had something in common with the Fool. Just the fact that he was setting out on a journey, and even the color of his clothes. There was several correspondences. If this is the Fool, on the path of the Fool, if this is the same character, well, then we know that there's something changed quite dramatically. There's been a considerable change. The only thing that really seems in common is that perhaps this guy's setting out on a quest of his own as well. Or that after setting out on the quest, he has learned about the world, he's that much more mature in one way, and that he's maybe using the tools at hand, given that there's this locomotive here. That maybe he's found a certain goal. There's something he is after, something he's chasing on the horizon, and he fashions for himself a vehicle because he's fervent now and he's focused now. This could be the will, could it not? You have consciousness, and then you have the focus of the will heading towards a particular desire, this or that. And often we're so caught up in that becomes then almost defines our character, defines our personality. But more importantly, in the previous program, we went into that whole thing about whether, can we find a scene between the act of seeking and the goal. We seem to always associate them, but maybe they're not as connected. We went into that whole thing because there's a major difference in worldview if they aren't connected. Because if our whole ardor and zeal isn't really ultimately secretly about the goals, well, then it is about the wind in one's hair. It's about the dust on the chariot wheels. It's about the trundle of the chariot. Meaning, it's about sensation and the present tense. That's the supreme thing, and as long as we've got the sensation, that's the meaning in itself, and it's academic, really, if there's a goal. We may have that as an excuse, but then we may, divert from that at any given point. And after all, this is a lunar card, as we said before. It's Cancer. And where we have the moon, you do have vacillation and restlessness and ever-changing personas as a true identity is being searched for. And we also warned before that maybe the whole goal, all of this activity, it doesn't necessarily mean it's towards selfhood. What happens if you're walking in the footsteps of others on that great road, as we said before? That's just inauthentic. We also pointed out that on that road, the road of life, because we dissociate and because we repress content, the past actually can be dominant. And it's like that whole question of the Red Queen running as fast as you can and getting nowhere, standing still. So what is this chariot doing? What is any of our movement doing if it's the past that's looming on the road ahead? And we also went into the whole concept of how repression comes about from that approval or disapproval, the prohibitions of our parents, which in turn they've learned from their parents and society. So it's the collective then that establishes our own ideas about ourselves and our reality. This doesn't sound very wholesome. Because those images that we now have of ourselves, of our goals, they may not be true, they may not be authentic, and because they're not, they lead to inner conflict. Why? Because the road on which we're traveling is actually getting further and further from the person we truly are. Is that the road we're traveling? That at every step and at every turn, we're actually getting further and further away from the real authentic self because we're in obedience and conformity to what the collective is demanding of us? That's going to cause enormous inner turmoil because the true self, right? The true self doesn't die. It's not going anywhere. It may be put inside a box and put inside a box, but the natural doesn't die and doesn't disappear. And so in some bizarre way, as Jung and other psychologists noticed, the content of the consciousness looms on the road ahead. And this can almost negate what we normally take to be a vertical process. We talked about the superego and how that's the representative of all of that collectivism and all that parental prohibition within our own heads. We learn to embody the imperatives of these parents and teachers in society. But we were repressing within ourselves, we learn to repress everything that they disapprove of. But these aspects that are repressed are key aspects of our own being, of our own self. They're living aspects of ourselves. So we're learning to incarcerate aspects of our own being. That's been accepted by the psychologists. This isn't something insignificant. We become our own jailers. But those banished aspects want to be integrated, and this is fundamental. And therefore they loom on the path ahead, to be met on the path ahead. So future and past have a connectivity that is rarely, if ever, mentioned by anyone. But to me, this is an extraordinary situation. And on one level, it might be a good thing. If we've repressed the true self, to erect the pseudo-self, hey, maybe then time is not the enemy we think it is. If time is doing this, saying, oh, well, you're going to meet the repressed content down the line, because you have to come to order. The universe, like we said in the previous program, is about order and psychic balance. And if you don't have it, the fates are going to conspire to say, you're going to get it. Or you're going to destroy yourself in the tug of war between. Keep resisting the order. Keep resisting the psychic balance, the coming to equilibrium. And see what becomes of you and of the society of which you're an integral part. So are we now to say, like Hegel said and others, that time and history is actually helping us in the restoration of order, both individually and also socially? Is this the process by which balance is restored? Getting rid of the inauthentic patterns? Maybe time deserves a kiss after all? Maybe we need to learn how to work with time in a much more reverent and attentive way? And the great mystics are saying, and once that order is restored, time as we experience it does end. Now, something else opens up, but we're not going to know what that is on this side of the wall. But time ends. Other doors are opened, other portals are opened. We're not using the reason, we're using imagination. We're using deeper visionary aspects of ourselves. The sage and God enter into a new life. Not in some other realm, but right here where you are. Now it's like some comedy. We're missing God going out the swing doors. He's missing us because He's here present in this world. He's not focused on any other realm except here where His creations are. We're the ones out there thinking about life after death and other realms and God being in some mystical zone and trying to meet. So there's a constant missing of each other. Mostly because of our own fault. He's where He needs to be. We're in the next world, somewhere else. But in my work I've always mentioned that in order to really know order, you have to know disorder. You have to first become fundamentally aware of disorder. And that doesn't just mean in the world, out there, in the lives of people. The real disorder that one has to finally analyze is the disorder within oneself. And also the inauthentic ways in which a pseudo-order comes about. That takes us into the realm of philosophy and psychology, of course. And for us to practically understand something about what I've just said, these cards help us. If we, again, put them side by side, something interesting looms up. Something very, very fundamental and interesting. Also in the names of the cards, Crowley renamed Strength Lust. And we'll be looking at it in the next program. But if you look at them side by side, they actually represent two different modes of consciousness, but also two paths to that order, or enlightenment, shall we use that hackneyed word. They represent the ascetic, right? That's the ascetic, A-S-C-E-T-I-C, ascetic, versus the tantric modes of being. So these cards now take on a tremendous importance. Austerity versus ecstasy or delight. Time, with all of our desires and personal aspirations, and eternity. Order, disorder and order. Inhibited versus uninhibited. Armored versus unarmored. So what I mean by that is that the chariot, just look at it, all that armor, all that rigidity, that is encapsulating the austere, right, forms of yoga, which are thought necessary by so many schools to attain spiritual enlightenment. Whereas the strength card is encapsulating a totally different mode, an ecstatic, not ascetic, but ecstatic approach, which, if you like, can be referred to as tantric, given that you understand what the word tantric originally refers to and not what a bunch of Western Californiags think it refers to. It's the earliest forms of yoga, the earliest forms of religion, pre-Vedic, going back to an original Aryan concept. Now the former approach, the ascetic life, that became dominant after the rise of the priests, both in the East and also in the West, after the rise of the malignant patriarchy. And that approach is totally antithetical, to positive goddess cults of the ancient world, and as I said, the Aryan cults. The Maya of South America referred to this duad, these two different paths, as tonal and nagual. William Blake described these antipodes as devouring and prolific. Aleister Crowley refers to them as Nuth and Hadith. Hadith is the contracted reality, Nuth is the expansive reality. In Kabbalah, they're known as the pillar of severity versus the pillar of mercy. And we saw in the last program that they're known as Dasein, Sosein being the negative polarity, and Dasein being the positive one in the mystic traditions. Now this man who's under rigid self-control might want to also live in a society of rigid controls, rules and regulations and laws. He's a dogmatic fundamentalist. He might be in favor of being controlled. He might also be in favor of controlling other people. So we don't even have to deal with men on a mystical path. This is something that, this exercise of control, can be turned within to the body, where you have the armoring. It can come from, it can be a mental rigidity that is so extreme and malignant that it actually starts to think of not only the body but nature as something inferior and lower. You turn to Alvin Boyd Kuhn, the great writer, and he talks about this. He says, one of the most virulent aberrations resulting from the cult of anti-nature has been the exhibition of near masochism throughout the history of religion. And he's talking about the negative patriarchy. The reference is to the cult of asceticism, with a full sweep into Western Christian consciousness of the doctrine of the sinfulness of the flesh. There came the preachment of the evils of the world, the flesh and the devil, giving rise to the pratique of self-mortification. So there you are. Asceticism, self-mortification, the suppression of the natural, the organic. And he says the brutal suppression of all natural impulses. The spirit was all, the flesh was evil, and the deadly enemy of the immortal soul. So those fixed goals, the one-size-all paths, methodologies, practiques, as he said, and the reward mechanism. The ascetic is victimized by these fixed ideas about cosmos, fixed ideas about God, fixed ideas about the way to God, the fixed ideas about the self. He's going to repeat the same mantras over and over again. He's got a fixed idea of what he wants as a reward, and so on, so on, so on. But he never stops to think that the image of God that he has in his mind, as we've been implying, mightn't be his own. That might be some other guru, or the collective, the group to which he's become joined. It may have matured over generations. Hasn't it? God is a trinity over here, he's a quaternity over there. Here he's a circle, there he's a phallus, here he's a dove, and over here they call him a gas of divine spirit. He's a tree, he's a serpent, he's a stone. Now, that armoring, to explain more, is that this ascetic person now is not having a relationship with his body any more than he is with nature. He certainly knows it's there, but all of these impulses that rise up within him, all these urges, sexual or other, he's not accepting them, these impulses. He's completely shutting them down, as I said, self-incarcerated. And he does it because of the expectations of others, even if that's other is a god, a phantasm. But we're doing it every day to the physical people around us. What we're doing is placing grids over our minds, like trestle will control ivy, like a dam sections off a river, the flow of a river, like immigration guards at a border, crossing point. See, there's some sort of filtration. Imagination isn't allowed to flow freely. What that means, of course, is that the constituents, the roots, the actual elements or forces that make consciousness, actually what consciousness is made of, never get to express themselves as they are. Their nature is fractured and adulterated from the outset. How can that be good? And M. Esther Harding, psychologist, in her book Psychic Energies, she says, when the ego, in its determination to be master, removes itself too far from the instincts, it loses its contact with life stream within, with the life stream within. It becomes more and more shut up within itself, restricted to its own resources, which are at best very limited, so that in course of time the sap of life within it dries up. A life that is lived only within the precincts of the conscious ego becomes arid and sterile and stands in danger of death. That's Alvin Boyd Kuhn's mortification. You're living a psychic death, as millions upon millions of people are. Just take a look around you. What comes of all this rolling of beads, mantras, and bowing in front of altars, and the feet of these towel heads and mushroom men. And sages such as Blake and Wilhelm Reich and others knew that they were convinced that this is the road to utter destruction, not just for a single man, but for the whole of society. And Blake personified reason in its malignant form as Horizon, the great god Horizon, whose job it is to stick, piece, glue it all back together again, the fragments of a broken reality. And this is the son of Horizon, the lower octave charioteer setting forth to do exactly what his father has told him to do. But doesn't realize that in doing so, in stitching the world together, hammering it together into the shape that the mind has dictated, you've made the world now in your own image. Now that might not be too good of an idea, but that's what's occurred. And Alan Watts, writing on this very theme, says that our attitude to the world outside us is largely hostile. We are forever conquering nature, space, mountains, deserts, bacteria and insects, instead of learning to cooperate with them in a harmonious order. What, they don't experience anything? It's only human beings. I'm only interested in my experience of anything. I know daffodils, and leaves, and wolf, and horse, and oak tree. Sure, they have no experience that I'm worried about. What an impoverishment. Is that right? Does that sound true, that you're surrounded by all this? It's just inanimate. That's just a resource that I exploit and knock into shape. Well, there's your super rational tendency. So let's see how far it's going to get the human race. Because as I said before, in an individual man, that same attitude can be interjected. Aren't you alive? You think only your mind has experience? Your body is a living thing. If you turn that rigidity, that malignancy within, oh my God. Dehumanization, desensitization follows. And all the other neurosis and physical ailments you see that come to that. But unlike the reason, Blake is saying, imagination, in the totality of what that word means, and let's explore that for a minute, it doesn't penetrate and invade as a foreign entity. It's not murdering to dissect, as Wordsworth said. It's not seeking to keep itself apart on an Archimedean pedestal while it peers into reality. It's not keeping itself shielded as it looks at what life is. It's not insulated against what it experiences. In fact, imagination has all those capacities of blending, of integration, of empathy, which is vital for you to know that other things have an experience of life. Imagination, unlike reason, creates a true relationship with the thing that is being observed or understood. Because it allows itself to participate, not just stand, as I said, rigidly, objectively. It seeks, but it also is open to receive what is happening in that environment. Like you walk into a desert, it has a different environment than if you're up at the Arctic. You're in a city, it has a different feel than if you're in a country lane. So are you morphing to each situation? Realizing that there are no permanent Archimedean points, and that you just can't remain adamantine like a block of marble, which most of these scientists and other religious types are doing, sectioned off from the world and making it in its own image. Thinking that human experience is all that matters, that there is only human experience, period. All sensitivity gone. So, imagination is that polyphrenic mode of consciousness. Pliable, receptive, curious. Not just after knowledge as a man is after coins of gold to stuff into his pockets. Not voracious. The imagination is allowing the world to change it, right? To affect it. Doesn't want to be the same entity tomorrow as it is today, or even the next minute. Imagination understands that reality is changing, reality itself. Hegel so stressed this, and Blake understood it too, that what you call reality changes every second, and it changes you, and then you reciprocally change it again. So it's a constant movement, a constant flow, a constant dance. And as I said earlier, this perspective is actually confirmed now by the most recent scientific discoveries into the quantum realm. But again, I emphasize, where are the repressions kept? Right? We have the ascetic type, and his practices of mortification and asceticism. Where are the repressions kept? Not in a box under the bed, in the self, in the heart, in the cells of the body, in the fibers and meridians of the body. So we make our bodies actually containers of psychic garbage. Take a look around. The repressed memories, the intolerable hurts and angers that we've repressed. It's okay to a degree, but chronically to do it all the time, that dissociation or repression, these become the coping mechanisms. The coping mechanisms, and then paradoxically they're undermining greater health, causing hardening of the body, as I said, and then illness and neurosis. After long usage of the imagination, the mystic discovers, unlike the rationalist, that he is experiencing quantum changes, seismic changes, a sensitization that no other man near him can ever replicate or deduce. The ego that once served the reason, how limiting that is, by problem solving and question making, like I said, the seeking, keep asking the questions and keep seeking the answers, round and round we go. Well, the ego, now the imagination, the ego becomes the servant of the imagination, becoming its agent, becoming an amplifier of the imperial self, not just of the pseudo-self. That's a completely different attunement, total different alignment to the natural order, to the logos. But it can't be explained. It's the oceanic experience, you see. that constitutes this great spiritual step forward. And once you've made it, you know, there's no words. You can't go around drawing pictures for other people. You may be able to communicate it in other ways, non-verbal, but you know, there's no Bibles and Torahs and Korans are ever going to contain that. And it is that person then who now can affect real change in the world. Right? So you have to take your pick. Here the tarot is telling you something, asking us something. There's two roads. But the thing is that the tantric man, the man of ecstasy, the man of imagination, is an implacable enemy of the status quo and all those satanic mills. Now if we turn back to the card, see that the chariot is drawn by these two enigmatic sphinxes. I think this is interesting, because they obviously symbolize the inner and outer worlds. They're black and white. They may also symbolize the death and rebirth we spoke of earlier. Their heads are slightly averted. And that reminds me of the lions that you see at the edges of the tables of the mummification process in Egyptian papyrus. The table upon which the mummy sits has two lions, and they're looking away in opposite directions. But they also can represent the higher and lower that we kind of referred to, but preferring words like shallower and deeper, or pure and impure, or hygienic versus unhygienic. And they could represent the divide that he is trying to reconcile. But he's doing it. He's getting out on the road to say, well, let's see where these animals pull. Let's see what happens when I exercise, you know, both these capacities. It's in the physical world that I'm going to test it. But they also can represent that because of this fractured consciousness, if he's charging out there to pattern the world and forge it into shape of the human, well, then there's going to be a lot of cracks in that edifice, because if his inner division isn't cured and fixed, well, then that's inevitable. And that, unfortunately, does define modern man. He's doing a lot of hammering, a lot of nailing, but for everything he puts up, something else is crumbling. That's because his own being is flattened out. The hammer and tongs are working, but man is flattening out his own being. He's just a handyman or a janitor to the problems he creates for himself that weren't even there originally. A slave to inauthentic time, a fixer. It's like painting the Golden Gate Bridge. You know, it takes so long to do it that by the time you put the last dab of paint on it, it needs to be painted again from the start. And what about this kind of man? What other negative trait does he have? Isn't he a collectivist? Because he's not just doing his work on his own. All this mending and fixing of the world of lies. Well, he feels comfortable and happy when he's in the company of other people doing the same thing. Here come the trolls. Everybody working on that project. Well, we're getting on with it. What are you talking about? Out of our way. And then next thing you know, you're building a hierarchy of fixers and menders and problem solvers. Then you've got governmentality installed. And in extreme cases, all humanness is trampled on, and you've got the panopticization of the whole planet. Because this is a big project. We've been given our orders, mate. Here's the map. Don't come over and talk about a lot of stuff about inner work and psychic hygiene and individuality and aloneness. What's all that about? Well, nothing to do with that. These are the men, as we said in the last program, who choose the path of So-Sign, quite happy to walk in the footprints of those who've gone before. That's the path of safety, right? The wheels may be going at a furious pace, but they're in the ruts made by the previous chariots that went ahead. What's individualistic about that? What are they trying to sell us? So at that point, the lunar nature then of this card might make more sense. It is passive. It is somewhat docile. It's not shining with its own light. It takes reflections of reality for reality itself. Get it? Well, this is the false picture endorsed by all the fellows. The herd, the collective, is, as Gustave Le Bon said, is a feminine entity. The collective, or the herd, the mass mind, is a feminized mind. It's not individualistic. It may arm itself up and trundle off to war So to all intents and purposes look like an aggressive monster thrashing around. No, think again. Where's the individual mind in that mix? In those Occupy movements and everything else collective that the world has thrown up, telling us that there's going to be remedy and redress of ills. Well, the man who knows that he's never going to shine by his own light is addicted then to the radiance offered by that crowd. His chariot is aligned to a lighthouse, a beacon. Who lit that fire? Where does he think he's going? He's driving a cart, a chariot, a wagon. He's not even walking on his own 2 feet. Who made that locomotive? His Confederates? Is he doing as they did? Is he so inherently weak that he needs an exoskeleton of a suit of armor? That's his persona, his pseudo-self, to define himself? He may be very busy, but is his activity directed simply by externals? Is that what he's animated by? Driven by? Passively following the social and political trends? Today, it's materialism dominates. Well, he goes along with a materialistic philosophy. No, today more. The next day it's spiritual and religious trends. Well, he signs on for that. He'll come down to the front. He's going to go along with that. The passive baby in the arms of his parents. This Cancerian energy that just doesn't shine with its own light. As I said earlier, the image does recall Phaeton or Icarus. And the esoteric meaning of that is not, as most have it, that it's wrong to fly to the stars, to fly to the sun. That's nothing wrong with that. It shouldn't be said that that is futile or arrogance that makes you do that. The warning is, don't make your wings out of wax. Be truly equipped for such a task. Do the homework, do the preceding steps. Do the basic work first. Put that in place, make sure that's done. The negredo before you can get to the albedo, right? But that's, we said in the previous program, purification, contemplation. Where are those? What kind of progress do you think you're going to make without that? Where's your nobility of spirit? To look God right in the eye as He wants to look you in the eye. Do you think that the real God that exists wants to look at you as you're crawling along the ground towards Him? Is that what He calls my son? My daughter? You're ready to do my work? Well, with the priests with their feet on your neck and all the other authority figures, they've already caged your spirit and mind. That's where you're going to be until you snap out of it. Now the Chariot here is one of the most temporal cards in the deck, meaning of time. That's what I think. And we have to know about the mysteries of time to decode its deeper meanings. Because as we hinted before in the previous program, time actually starts with an act of self-deception. Remember? Because it's in the past that we form the desire that motivates us to be that desire. What is desire? So time is the soil of desire. They're connected. And the past is desire. It's created by desire. What we know to be the past is the place where we initiated who we wanted to be. And so that becomes immortalized. But as I've been saying, the person we actively move to become, to seek to become, that image may not be of our true selves. That may be a chimera, a phantasm, basically created or basically imposed by parents out of their impositions upon us and their constant badgering about what they think we should be. Well, that's inauthentic. And that'll be a never-ending process, karmic wheel, or more correctly, it's going to cause tension, because the further and further we get towards what we want, we're actually getting further and further away from the real self. A terrible, terrible situation to be in. And so the ability to waken up to this, what I'm saying, and stepping out of it, then becomes a very interesting process. How that's done, it's idiosyncratic, ideographic. But it's interesting, isn't it, that there is that memory to step out of it. So here we have another kind of paradox, that in the depth of delusion, in the depths of illusion, there's another voice always there to say, no, this is wrong. Or some would say, no, that just comes about academically, you have so many problems getting to the goal that in the end you give up. Well, that's so be it then. But I think there's a template underneath, a wholeness, the Logos whispering, to tell us that we're living inauthentically. It's kind of a pre-conscious wholeness, upon which we sit. Now Schelling, the German philosopher, was well into this, as was others as well, because they believe that we sit on just the peak of a little pyramid, while all this other beinghood and beingness is beneath us. We're not quite in touch with it, because there's a cloud bank concealing the rest of that mountain of wisdom and knowledge. But that voice does speak to us inwardly. But coming back more to the point, biologically, our clocks start with the mother. So time and the mother are connected. She represents the past for us on all levels, phylogenetically and ontogenetically. And that's interesting too, because this card, as we said, is lunar and is about the mother. It's very appropriate. The moon is connected to mothers and to females. And women, by the way, in history were the first to notice and measure the cycles of time. Okay, the passage of the luminaries and the stars and the planets, and the first to keep detailed calendars. So there's a tremendous connection here, even historically. Why is this important for us? Is because it's at the moment of birth, the early years of birth, that we're introduced to our own body's instinctual needs. Right? Before desires can be created, you're already into, I need this, I need that. And it's the mother, of course, goes without saying, should be the fulfiller, satiator of those. In other words, it's in her company that we not only are aware of these desires, but that we also have them satiated. And of course, this has a great bearing on our whole concept, our whole experience of time.
I've heard about you. You're very good. Why the change? Money?
No.
Sure. Give yourself a few years, you'll just be like everybody. What's so funny?
I am everybody.
What's that? Some kind of private joke?
I could have all the money I want.
Couldn't we all?
I know things.
Well, don't tell me. I've had enough of that kind of information.
Now, this isn't the type of information that they can prosecute you for.
Who's your source?
I am. I know everything.
What's my name?
Joyce.
That's easy. Everybody here knows me. You were staring at me the other night.
Do you believe in other lives?
Past lives?
No, I mean lives going on right now.
Like being in two places at once?
No, more than two. A lot more. I'm talking about possible worlds. Each of us exists in an infinite number of possible worlds. I mean, in one world, I'm talking to you right now, but your arm is a little to the left. And in another world, you're interested in that man over there. The glasses. And in another, you stood me up 2 days ago. And that's how I know your name. Building what?
I'm not sure.
Why don't you ask them?
They wouldn't understand me.
Why not?
Their language only has 2 words.
I know 2 of them.
Slav and block.
What's the third?
Hilarious.
What can you do with that?
Nothing.
Can you have a language with only 3 words?
So we see that we inherit the idea of time because of the needs of our own body. This makes perfect sense. But those precede the active needs of the mind, of desire. And these needs of the instinctual body, this is what the clock is all about. That's what they're measuring. Because those needs must be satisfied. But we also then quickly learn about the concept of delayed gratification. That's where the clock comes in. That's why it's a reality for us, because the needs aren't just immediately met. There's often a delay. There's always a delay, and that's a painful experience. And then this just increases as we age, and we have to play the whole waiting game. As a consequence, that undergirds society, undergirds its rules and regulations. There's really not much we can do about it, unless we want to become psychotic or criminalistic. So for the infant mind, time and suffering go hand in hand. This is one of the early first experiences. And that's courtesy of the superego, of course. Because we can't just grab the superego being the moral centers of conscience and what have you, or at least the imperatives, forcing us to delay gratification. Those prohibitive voices. So we're forced. We're forced to be victimized to that degree by time. And that kickstarts the whole process for us. Time becomes a big reality from that moment on. And the mother is key to the development of the superego. So there's always this need to be satiated immediately, but also have to learn the rules and regulations where we can't just have what we want when we want it. And the clock then delineates these gaps between satiation of desire, fulfillment, or its lack. Without the desire, though, and this is the key point really, without the desire and without the delay of desire, there wouldn't be time. Time as we know it is the delayed gratification between getting what we want, desiring what we want and getting what we want. And as we said, the strange thing is that in this process, the parts of our mind that we've had to repress, the parts of our being that we're forced to repress by the superego voice and by society, raise up on the road ahead of us. And so the past appears to influence the future, thereby negating the common illusion of progress. And sort of nixing the idea that the whole thing is some sort of linear vertical process. When we do develop this concept of time, we also have, running parallel to it, the concept of eternity. But obviously, since time is activated by desire, eternity mustn't be a place in which desire is active. We're trapped within time and desire at this point, and not able to then conceive of something that lies beyond the cage. As Taoist Chung Tzu said, the desire to end desire is still a desire. However, as I said, we seem to have a template within us, part of us, that already transcends desire. And that is the mind or the imagination, as Blake would have it. And last time we actually spoke of time as we know it and experience it. We said it could be described as shadow time. We didn't have time to really unpack that. Right now we can take a deeper look at what that whole concept means. The whole reason why time is activated is not only to do with the delayed gratification, but because of the repressions, as we said, which we learn from the same source. But what that really means in simple language is that we are not accepting ourselves for who we are. That's why we dissociate. That's why we repress. Those two things wouldn't exist if we were allowed to accept ourselves as we are. So our attitude towards ourselves is not one of self-love and self-acceptance. It's one of self-hate and self-loathing and self-sadism. And the strange paradox of that is that the world and the parents are mapping our progress, so to speak, on how far we're getting away from our real selves. By 14, we can't even stand our parents because they represent this, let alone earlier conflicts in the family dynamic. But even over the whole of our time, if it's not family members, parents, it'll be some surrogate version of the same thing, approving and awarding medals. For what? The more and more conformist and flat I become. But the key is that it's seeking their approval that sets this whole thing in motion. All of the self-loathing, all of the repression of our natural being, natural state, is being caused because of the chronic need for the approval of these peers and parents, these derelict peers and parents. Right? The superego being the inner representative of the crowd consciousness, determining our self-image, compelling the rise and the creation of a pseudo-self, which then asphyxiates or tries to asphyxiate the real self. Now, if your parents were themselves pseudo-selves, how on earth are they going to teach you what it is to be a true self, a whole self, a holistic person? How are they going to introduce you to that authenticity? And so, as I said, our very ambitions and most of our desires are the basis, the result of an act of self-deception. The creation of the pseudo-self that becomes the central voice of our consciousness. The ego being the center of that, becoming the ego, the engine driver, and the superego is the overseer with his clipboard and his whistle. And the tracks, well, they're, as we said, laid by society. Now, the wild places is where we are attracted to go, but we find those are fenced off with electrical fences, just as the unconscious, so-called, is a sectioned off aspect, the shadow realm of our own being, is also ring-drawn with barbed wire. And so the superego now becomes the internal voice of God, where God is really identical to society. And so time, inauthentic time, and God suddenly become connected now. So one wheel of the chariot is this authentic existence, the potential for that, and the other is the inauthentic wheel. The two sphinxes looking separately. The two wheels that could be one sticking in the mud, one trying to go in one direction and the other pulling in another direction. And if we make a little diagram, a little scheme of this, then the CC, which can be the same as God, is crowd consciousness. And that equals SS, super ego settings. The crowd determines. Leading to PD, psychic dissociation or repression. Huge chunks of ourselves being cast into darkness. Leading to PS, inauthentic pseudo-self. Leading to ID, inauthentic desires and goals. Do you see how it connects? And then that in itself sends us hurtling into a world in which we experience inauthentic time, IT. Because the images that we're pursuing, they're created by the world, not by ourselves. Now, the moment that we see what's going on, we make a serious existential change, as I said. Out goes the false God, and out goes the concept of another world, a supernatural world. It's just another projection of desire. Well, after life I'll get there and I'll get what I deserve. Out goes the will of the masses. Out goes selflessness and self-sadism. And out goes time as we know it. Out goes self-hate self-loathing, in comes self-love. All the external idols are smashed. We're not listening to the approval of the crowd, so our self-esteem can now rise up to where it needs to be. One becomes one's own measure and judge. And that requires a strengthening, doesn't it, of the faculties of reason. Reason's part of this process. Discernment, discrimination, but it's now under the tutelage of the imagination. This is why wholeness and holiness are connected. One doesn't have a lack to be fulfilled. He's able to disconnect because he's no longer having desires in the same way that others have them. Remember, the body has its desires, and those certainly need to be met. We become expert at doing that. But the mind, the imagination, is desireless. And that's why all these different chords of inauthenticity can be cut. Because the mind can exist and think, but without desire. And this in turn then opens the doorway, as I said before, to deeper and deeper insights. We move out of mortal time into immortal time. As Blake would have phrased it, we come out of the Newtonian sleep and step into eternity. Directing us in this activity is Nietzsche's will to power. We still need a force. But instead of that force just simply engaging the desires of other people and coming up against them in loggerheads, it's separate now. We're not just moving to fulfill inauthentic desires in the flow of inauthentic time. We're individuating, and we need a will to do that. This is a sort of alchemical transformation. We have to rise up to the Heilig from the hedonic state, become pneumatic, what's known in certain traditions as the pneumatic level, spiritual level. You can only do that through an alchemical transformation, which starts off by first becoming psychological, becoming philosophical. So in the end we realize from all of this that there's really two kinds of time. There's the body time and the satiation of the body's desires in whichever way that can be achieved. And then there's this mental time, which Blake talked about as being eternity. And so these two sphinxes that you see then can easily represent that. You'll notice that there's also a winged orb on the chariot, suggesting pneumatic experience, higher spiritual experience. And we have in our life to sort of get those two types of time working together in a kind of a balance. The body's needs, certainly, those represent desires of a kind and they need to be fulfilled. But there's this other state of detachment in which another kind of a reality exists. Now, according to William Blake, you see, all the other non-human stuff of the world, the rocks, the trees, the birds, they have their bodies here with us in the world of temporal time, mundane time. But they have the roots of their being in eternity, as we also do. And we only see their outward shapes or their shadows. And this outer shell, for those who are interested, is the shell of vegetative life, as Blake called it. And it's ruled over by a goddess called Vala. A kind of being that's somewhat similar, close to, in Blake's early works, pretty much the female version of Horizon. We also notice, as I said, in the Thoth deck, that you see the charioteer in full armour, but he's carrying a chalice, or a grail almost. And, well, that makes a lot of sense, because the higher octave charioteer has fought these two battles, has brought these two times together, two versions of time together into a balance, but he's also fought two battles. He's fought the inner battle within himself so that he can enter into eternity. And then he sets himself about freeing humanity and directing humanity towards this same state. He can't do it for them, but he can certainly direct people, if they want, to that kind of state. So maybe the Black Sphinx represents this inner fight in the inner house, in the secret time, in the secret world. And the White Sphinx is now his commitment to that external fight and tribulation. In one sense, as the higher octave Cancer, he's the mother of all mankind, of all humankind. He knows what men need and what they desire. In this capacity, he's like Hermes or Mercury. Both a lunar being who took care of the inner world and a solar being who now can his light, his model, can work for the outer world. And Blake believed that this was very important to have these two worlds. And he believed that there's even an appropriateness about the struggle of opposites. Because he said in that struggle, man learns about what it means to know something other than himself. The polarity leads him into rapport, into empathic rapport with other entities and beings. Like I said, do you think you're the only thing that has experiences in the world, is just a human? Now last program we said that clearly the real motive of all true mystics is simply to bring order to disorder. And that involves a process, and self-work has to be done at the beginning, at the outset, otherwise it won't work. This desire to do this work, to contact the Logos and then transmit it, is simply born out of nothing supernatural at all. It's born out of looking at the state, the terrible degeneracy of our world and the plight of nature. Isn't that enough motive for one to start asking all of these questions? You don't need any angelic help, really, if you're attentive to what's going on around you. Man and God, as we said, are the products of this supernal, this higher order. God and man, Logos and Sophia, working together, bringing light into the darkness, moving, as Hegel might have put it, towards the absolute idea. The mind of man, which he termed reason, working in harmony with a greater plan. It's the great magnum opus in any case, and the higher man responds to that call. He doesn't invent the call. This is the interesting thing. There's a template, there's some archetypal call. So, as we said, even in the darkest of the dark nights, there's something nagging you, telling you, you're not living correctly. Well, how could that be? Even down in the dungeon, you see. So in the smaller is the greater. Now the lower man, he wants nothing of this. He just remains in disorder, happy for other people to tell him what to do. They're smarter than me, like, you know. I just wait for instructions. I get a reward if I carry out those orders really well. That's what I'm after. And to understand the card that we're looking at deeply, then you just understand there are two forms of order. There's the draconian, enforced, ascetic approach, the malignant control of the body. The Sons of Urizen prefer that. And there's the more free-flowing, feminine, higher feminine, let's just say for now, mode that can embody creation, sustaining and destruction without any problem. Not trying to interfere with what life is. Rather, you're trying to let it work with you, to teach you. And that process starts with the infant. The infant can be armored because of its relationship with the parents, or taken out into nature and exposed in a completely different way, so that it has a concept and more likelihood then of being aroused by this Logos, this voice that is within. How are you going to hear it in any other circumstance, you see, unless the space is there. Templum, templo. The very word temple means space. Do we look like we have any space today? Can it be attained by somebody who's under chronic psychic control, highly armored, where even the musculature and the cells and the meridians of the body are under taut control, and bioenergy is simply not flowing? An asceticism that's akin or identical to auto-hypnotism, that's going to do it. Not just in the individual, but the whole planet. Under these black robes and mushroom heads and other false New Age gurus. You think that's what it's all about? To find the still point? That's a dead, constricted, emaciated, malignant, pratique, mortification? No. It's a state of allness, right? The wheel of allness. The spokes encompass everything, totality. But there's the center in the middle. But that's not a static, dead center. Wholeness. Totality. The eye in the cyclone, the eye at the center of the storm. That's the magic, that's the sacred. It's vital, it's alive. It's a part of everything, but it's a part of it as well. And if a certain detachment is involved in this process, it's not a cold, neurotic detachment of a broken soul that just went down that path because he failed to get the other, didn't get the stripes, didn't get approved of by everybody else, didn't get that pat on the head. So I'm on a mystical path. I'm seeking for God. He might give me the stuff that mum and dad didn't give me. No, it's a totality of vision and understanding. From a being that doesn't need anything psychologically from anyone. As Nietzsche knew, the self is not static. It changes with every struggle and triumph. As Hegel said, the world moves and changes every second. You can't stop it, it's a flow. And you, likewise, can't afford to be static in any way. It's a road that when you walk it, every step changes you. And you also become stronger and wiser and clearer. What's the realization you're working to? The mental freedom of thinking without desire, but not negating the other ontologically built-in desires. You've expertly learned how to get those fulfilled, but up here there's something else going on. And if there is a return to selfhood, a Euroboric full circle, as many mystics describe it, right, but that's not a static self that you then come back to commune with. It's one that's renewed and different. Just as T.S. Eliot said in his great poem, we return to the place of the beginning and know that place for the first time.
Our house has burned down. Now where will we go? Our house has burned down. Now where will we go? Now where will we go? Now where will we go? The invisible magician has cast a spell. We'll strike on the edge. Get me out of this hell. 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 Struck on the edge, I've never seen the stars so clear. Struck on the edge, I've never seen the stars so clear. Evil magician has cast a spell. A predator lying through my teeth. Overlords of entropy. A predator lying through my teeth. Overlords of entropy. I know only I can. I know only I can save me. I know only I can save me. I know only I can save me. stars so clearly. I've never seen the stars so clearly. I've never seen the stars so clearly. I've never seen the stars so clearly.